Howdy folks, and welcome to Tex Talks History, a series which I hope will serve to entertain and inform while maintaining some semblance of actual historical professionalism. For our very first topic, A Christmas to Remember. To give this story context, we must begin at the turn of the 20th century, when some very bold pioneers combined the fun of handmade engines with the terror of handmade gliders to finally determine once and for all what actually flew and what just exploded in the process. Eight days before Christmas, 1903, the Wright brothers made history. After much experimentation, frustration, and failure, Orville and Wilbur Wright's success at Kitty Hawk proved that practically anybody could make a plane. Even two brothers from Ohio whose entire engineering experience up to that point was more or less bicycles. Before that day, they were crazy small business owners with grand ideas. After that day, the Wright brothers were world famous and thus historically significant. The history of early aviation was cemented as a place where even from humble beginnings, great things were indeed possible if you were bold, brave, or just crazy enough to see things through. As such, the world quickly noticed and celebrated a handful of amateurs who had succeeded where many other respected institutions and noted individuals had not. Many of the smartest engineers of that time had given up after their own failures, many declaring the endeavor beyond their means or practically impossible. Sir Hiram Stevens Maxim was one of them. Yes, Maxim Gun Maxim. Yes, that Hiram Maxim. Yes, he too had tried to make a flying machine, and as you'd expect, it's straight out of Arcanum. Keep in mind, Maxim was born 11 years before Melville wrote Moby Dick, so his lens of the world would be, to us, very strange. And limited as that lens was, he made up for it by being, well, Maxim. For instance, he opted not to use gasoline because it was frankly too new for the man. And back then, gasoline was seen as a dangerous, if useless, waste byproduct of petrochemical distillation processes. They used to just dump or pour gasoline wherever they could, or burned it off as quickly as they made it. Maxim instead was of the old school, which means he was a fanatic steam enthusiast like all enterprising gentlemen of the period. So he decided his flying machine would be powered by twin, naphtha-fired steam engines rated at 360 horsepower, because that's how Maxim solved problems. Mind you, this is in contrast to the Wright brothers' own successful aircraft engine, which developed 12 horsepower. It also weighed under 200 pounds. Maxim's did not. Maxim was perhaps excessive, but his aircraft design was significantly heavier than air and most cars of the time. And as steam engines go, they were revolutionary, but far too heavy for something that should fly under its own power. For steam fans out there, it is of note that they could raise available steam pressure from 100 to 200 pounds per square inch in a single minute. Maxim being Maxim, when the batshit thing didn't fly right, he instead engineered what was called a captive flying machine. Yeah, Maxim was pretty damn prolific. Yes, the guy who invented these goofy rides for theme parks also invented the modern belt-fed machine gun, and occasionally seriously bothered Thomas Edison. Yes, I'd love to do a profile on him sometime, as I assure you the rest of his life is just as splendidly contrasted by whimsy and madness. Contextual tangent aside, after many notable and incredibly expensive failures, the Wright brothers seemingly proved that aviation was a business which favored small, independent startups building practical, if revolutionary, products. Further, the Wright brothers' success story suggested that just about anybody could be a plane tycoon overnight. To prove that point, prior to aircraft as a business, William E. Boeing was a Yale-educated lumber entrepreneur. In 1909, though, he bought the Hayes Shipyard at the mouth of the Duwamish River, or as it would be called in time, Boeing Plant No. 1. And this was a time of auspicious beginnings, as between the Wright brothers and Boeing, there was a number of enthusiastic pioneers at work, each advancing the field of aviation, one hop, skip, and crash at a time. That decade, Glenn Curtiss worked for Dr. Alexander Graham Bell under the Aerial Experiment Association, which provided funding, direction, and research to produce a rapid succession of successful aircraft out of nothing but crazy ideas. While pretty awesome for early aviation, AEA had a limited mandate, and when the funding ran dry, Bell extended it with additional financing as he realized aeronautics was pretty much the coolest thing in the world at the time. It was very niche, mostly unregulated, hilariously expensive, extremely loud, and with the occasional explosion offered as scientific entertainment, it was a natural field for Dr. Bell to cultivate. Dr. Bell was like that. He worked on a few things you might recognize, like hydrofoils, the telephone, founding AT&T, and then in 1880 he gave us the photophone, which used light to send communication wirelessly. Again, in 1880. These were only some of his dabblings. The man was prolific, and he was not selfish with his fame or resources, as Dr. Bell fostered interests in a number of fields which paved the way for many future innovations. As eccentric inventors go, he was pretty much the model of getting shit done and putting resources where they might have a chance at actually doing some good. So when AEA finally shut down, and with Dr. Bell's graciously extended experimental mandate concluded, Glenn Curtiss partnered with Augustus Moore Herring to form the Herring-Curtiss Company, renamed 1910 to the Curtiss Airplane Company. They would go on to provide the world with some of the best aircraft of that era, if not the coolest ever made. And while these early pioneers were turning bold ideas into products that actually changed the world, and through that, becoming world famous, fabulously wealthy, or powerful, there were naturally those who saw such greatness and desired it for themselves. Whether they were capable or not, qualified or not, they too desired a slice of the pie. And so there was another guy who started a company in the shadow of these soon-to-be giants. He too was a doctor who had fostered an intense interest in aeronautics. His name enters the historical record as Dr. William Whitney Christmas, and he proposed to change the aviation world through his dynamic genius. While many historians, aviation experts, eyewitnesses, correspondents, and primary sources are swift to judge Dr. William Whitney Christmas in no particular order as a liar, conman, cheat, shyster, pretender, rogue, defrauder, quack, scammer, chiseler, rascal, imposter, crook, charlatan, or wholesale crazy person, I'd rather start with the honest facts before we proceed to the wholesale, and I assure you, exhaustively researched character assassination. Let us begin the Odyssey of Dr. Christmas by stating for the historical record that William Whitney Christmas was in fact a very real doctor, as in he had proceeded down a course of education, instruction, and certifications deliberately in succession in order to become a qualified doctor of medicine. Up to this point in his life, it is a normal progression of events in sequence to produce a reasonable outcome. Yes, this is called foreshadowing. As far as I am able to determine, Dr. William Whitney Christmas was likely born in 1865. As far as we can prove, he attended St. John's Military Academy for his bachelor's degree and the University of Virginia for his master's. He then graduated from George Washington University in 1905 as a legitimate doctor of medicine. So for the record, everything that follows began as a garden variety medical doctor early in his professional years, which I'm sure helped him design aircraft. But let's not laugh too soon. For those of you finding this idea completely ridiculous, I did ask you to keep something in mind earlier. We have established that aviation is a business from humble beginnings. The Wright brothers, prior to their success, made and fixed bicycles. Hiram Maxim was an insane serial hobbyist who occasionally got things near perfect. Boeing had been a lumber tycoon. Glenn Curtiss liked motorcycles. All of these people had been something else before they found great success in the early years of aviation. So why not a medical doctor? The answer to that question takes us to June of 1914, when the empires of Europe decided to go gloves off for the Intercontinental Heavyweight title of titles. They'd call it the Great War until we had another one that eclipsed the first. If you feel lost at this juncture, please worry not, as the First World War is a complex topic, but the simple version is fairly easy to digest. Basically, somebody shot a guy, and then, for various reasons, Europe burned down for a while. There were tanks, there were planes, there were man-made horrors beyond mortal comprehension. A deeper take than that may emerge in time, but the First World War is, more or less, a monumental clusterfuck of alliances and industrial powers with a fair bit of polka music mixed in. It would grow to a grand global contest of seeing how many folks the great chain could pull under before somebody tapped out. And before the end, Krupp would build a cannon to shoot a whole city. For those curious, it's not the last batshit cannon they made. Yes, the Great War featured all sorts of wonderful new man-made horrors, and on a scale never before seen. While the militaries of the world had been using blimps or other observation balloons for centuries over battlefields, powered flight and choosing mostly where to be and sometimes when to be there were still relatively new concepts. By the time the Great War started, powered heavier-than-air flight was just 11 years old as a proven concept, so please do excuse their limited means when the war started. Because despite much early skepticism, powered flight quickly proved rather useful, and thus we arrive at the age of the observation aircraft. Early aircraft like the Ettrick-Rumpler Taube had been in Austro-Hungarian service, German Imperial service, and even Royal Naval Air Service prior to the war. As a scout and observation aircraft, the Taube was unarmed and with a maximum range of 87 miles, a top speed of 62 miles per hour, and a maximum ceiling above 6,000 feet for the exceptionally brave. The Taube was fairly basic, but it actually worked. Most aircraft back then were rarely, if ever, reliable even when new, and thus, early decent aircraft actually stand out on reliability alone. And it should be noted that at first, observation aircraft were typically unarmed until one day, somebody started throwing shit at other planes instead of keeping their hands to themselves for the duration of the ride. Pilots being pilots, this escalated, and before long every aviator was bringing whole toolboxes filled with nasty stuff. Then actual guns, then shotguns, then machine guns stolen from the infantry, then purpose-built machine guns for planes, and then the Fokker Scourge happened. Specifically because of this Fokker, which was designed by Anthony Fokker. He was considered a very marginal student until he saw a Wright brothers demonstration in France during the fall of 1908. History is funny like that. He would turn out to be one of the greatest designers of the era, if not all time. When first making military aircraft, he realized the key problem of aiming, then firing a machine gun through a spinning propeller to hit targets. Sometimes bullets might possibly hit that propeller, and that was probably pretty bad for the engine, and perhaps the pilot, because parachuting from aircraft was a concept less than 2 years old at that point. So, being the thoughtful man he was, he invented this very sexy interruption gear, allowing you to shoot right through the props without ever hitting them once. The French would in fact try to solve this whole shooting through the propeller problem by just putting a metal plate on the back of the prop, then telling the pilot, more or less, bon chance. As it turns out, ricochets are pretty bad, and shooting at a spinning propeller with a machine gun is something an 8-year-old would know is very dangerous. This unequal development of war material reminded generals that the air was a new front to fight in, contest, and possibly lose control over. Terrified at the thought of losing superiority over the air itself, aviation R&D was for the first time fully fueled by the war chests of global empires. And so, aircraft rapidly evolved. In a few short years, the powered civilian glider used for unarmed observation became a war machine, purpose-built to destroy other war machines. It soon became a contest of speed, skill, guts, glory, and mayhem. And as such, pilots of this era would become known through their daring actions, through media depiction, stories from the front and newsprint as Knights of the Sky, and thus were elevated instantly to the status of mythical heroes. And such mythical persons as the Red Baron were actually fairly tame when compared with the wildness of other squadrons of the era and their own rosters of unlikely aces. For instance, when your squadron's mascot is an actual wild animal, let alone two of them, it is a glorious age of aviation, one that belongs to the boldest and, perhaps, favoring those who had mastered the ability to act in spite of fear. Despite many early aviators having to teach themselves how to fly and then how to fight with unproven, if not brand new technology, these publicized and then celebrated successes began to dominate the news cycle of the time. The public was excited about this plane business, and the bold folks who flew them frequently to destruction. And if you made military aircraft, it was potentially a very lucrative time. What were originally garage businesses could, if successful, land contracts for not handfuls of planes as they had just years earlier, but hundreds, if not thousands at a time. For context, let's examine a few aircraft of this era and their relative historical and cultural importance. It is important to note that prior to the war, many of these aircraft were the product of wild imagination. Aircraft were handmade by the dozen at most. That too would soon change. The SPAD 13, as designed by Louis Bechereau, would end up in all 74 French fighter squadrons by the end of the war. Powered by a Hispano-Suiza V8 and with two very good Vickers guns, or the marginal Marlin 1917s if you wanted, which you did not, the SPAD 13 in any stripe was pretty much what you wanted in a great warfighter, which is why they built 8,472 of them by the end of the war, and why their list of operators is truly massive for a World War I aircraft. The United States would buy 893 of them with deliveries beginning 1918, and as such, the SPAD 13 serves as an excellent example of an early large aircraft defense export, and thus establishes the real value of military aircraft as a viable, exportable defense product. To be fair though, the SPAD 13 wasn't just numerous, it was actually good. And as pilots figured that out, the SPAD would grab headlines and thus forge legends out of their daring deeds. That's not to diminish the deeds of the pilots themselves either, as it's not the crate but the man in it. The SPAD, however, made their daring adventures survivable and thus repeatable. American pilot Edward Vernon Rickenbacker would go on to be the ace of aces for the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. From Columbus, Ohio, he took to the skies above Europe and scored 26 air-to-air kills during his brief time at war, of which 20 were in his SPAD 13. A Medal of Honor recipient, Rickenbacker later became the president of Eastern Airlines, bought and ran the Indianapolis Speedway for a time, and retired to Ohio after serving again in the Second World War. His entire career can trace his trajectory back to awkwardly firing up a SPAD for the first time over France and hoping he'd make it home. René Fonck was another spectacular case of SPAD enthusiast turned hero, with 75 air-to-air victories confirmed. He would claim 142, and most historians these days give him around 100. Made an officer of the Legion of Honor, a commander of the Legion of Honor, and raised to the dignity of Grand Officer of the French Republic, René proved that the SPAD was pretty much all you needed to keep Kaiser Bill in check by flying the 7, the 12, and then the SPAD 13 over the course of the war. René was also pretty crazy, as one of the test pilots for a special SPAD armed with a breech-loaded 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, Because there's no kill like overkill. Also, Zeppelins were a thing, mind you. Briefly, that is. Adil Rene is a near-perfect example of what the public considered a heroic SPAD pilot and a knight of the sky. But when asked about how he liked to fly, his comment was,
Quand je partais seul ainsi, je pouvais m'aventurer plus à mon aise, car je ne craignais pas de mettre en mauvaise posture des camarades moins expérimentés que moi. C'est alors que je me payais les petits coups d'audace qui m'amusaient. Dès 1915, j'ai voulu poser une mitrailleuse sur mon G3. Celle du bimoteur que j'eus ensuite était fixe, et quand j'utilise mon SPAD, je place mes balles au but comme avec la main.
These long and storied careers began with the SPAD. For most Allied aviators, it was the first plane they had which was reliable and actually decent enough to take to war and win. For most of the public, it was the first time they had been made aware of an aircraft which was produced in numbers greater than 100 and was famous for actually being decent as an aircraft, instead of merely able to fly. And the SPAD series of aircraft were not the only ones to find success or even popular acclaim in the press throughout the course of the war. The Sopwith Camel was another favorite of Allied air forces, and would have a production run of 5,490 by the war's end. It too produced legends and became through them a recognized name in aviation. Canadian ace Arthur Roy Brown was flying one of these things when he blasted Manfred von Richthofen out of the air, and was by most sources, at least for a time, awarded the kill credit. Historians being historians, they would later change consensus to ground fire being the source of the injury which claimed the Red Baron's life. But I suppose that is why most people don't like historians. For we unfortunately tend to remind people that the truth we find isn't always so kind, or pleasant, or even remotely popular. But the popular story in this case carried the day, because to the general public, only a knight of the sky could find, fight, and then kill another legend. That's not why the Canadians love the Sopwith Camel, though. It wasn't about killing notables so much as it was about reminding the world what true Norse strong and free meant. As such, Donald Roderick McLaren of Ontario, Canada, joined the Royal Flying Corps in 1917. A year later, the war was over. I feel his story best illustrates the madness of the air war, because I must say in that time, he had not only learned to become a pilot under accelerated instruction, he had then learned to fly the sometimes difficult Sopwith Camel, and then coaxed it into the air above continental Europe repeatedly until he ran into the Germans, who had a hell of a lot of experience flying airplanes up to that point, much of it in combat. In only 9 months of actual combat flying, and with no combat experience in figuring things out or, pardon me, flying by the seat of his pants, he became the Sopwith Camel's highest scoring ace with 54 air-to-air kills. And so, he became a legend, and success followed him, as he'd later become the Vice President of Operations for TransCanada Airlines and was the founding father of the Air Cadet League of Canada. All in all, the Sopwith Camel was good enough and in the right hands effective enough to grab the attention of the general public, if not forge enduring legends. Through that, it became celebrated as a cultural icon and a favorite Christmas toy for those fortunate enough to have such things in the years that followed. I mentioned the Allied aces of this war. Their lives and measured cultural impact contrasted with the planes they flew and their final production numbers for, again, necessary historical context. Because just 4 years earlier, the world was vastly different. On the eve of the Great War, the 6 greatest powers of the world combined had at most 750 aircraft, with few of those actually armed in any capacity. Many were planes used to train people to not be afraid of planes. Most were planes barely more capable than the Taube. Few could accomplish any mission at any range, and many were indeed very difficult to fly, if not dangerous to use as military aircraft. 4 years later, the world had changed. The sudden increase in the number of warplanes actually desired and used by the nations of the world was a new rapid global arms race and a fat exploitable new market with relatively few outstanding successes dominating the public's attention in press, print, and picture. And this did not go unnoticed, because against this very backdrop, Dr. Christmas had positioned himself as a visionary. By 1918, America had joined the war. Brigadier General John T. Thompson of Newport, Kentucky would be trying to figure out his trench broom around now. And in between serving as Director of Arsenals and winning the Distinguished Service Medal for his contributions, he would be a fairly busy guy. That same year, Dr. Christmas decided that he too would do his patriotic duty and directly contribute to the war effort. But to tell that story, we first have to figure out how exactly Dr. Christmas became an aviation pioneer. And that is where this story gets truly very interesting. While we can reliably say that he graduated medical school in 1905, his actions in the years immediately thereafter are substantially more difficult to follow in any meaningful detail. But it is during this time that Dr. Christmas developed a sudden and deep interest in aeronautical matters, which he would carry without any loss of enthusiasm whatsoever till the end of his days. In terms of his place as an aircraft pioneer, the strange saga of Dr. Christmas starts in roughly 1909. For that year, in Washington, D.C., he founded the Christmas Aeroplane Company. Dr. William Whitney Christmas, while again a doctor 4 years out of med school at that point, had pursued no certifications, education, or qualifications in matters related to aircraft design or the principles which govern it. But I suppose being a pioneer is all about taking chances. So he told his very first investors that he had designed a plane which had been built in 1908 and then lost in a crash sometime thereafter in the greater Washington, D.C. area. It was fairly normal at the time for early aircraft pioneers to litter the surrounding area with their previous ideas and unrealized successes. So these claims did not immediately worry his backers or detract from his professional credentials much. His backers didn't necessarily need to see an entire, intact aircraft to know that someone was an aviator. In those early years, few aviators kept planes for very long. So when Dr. Christmas was asked about his design, as he lacked the actual plane, he stated that the design as well had completely perished, but not on accident, and stranger still, not in the crash. At this point, he informed this group of investors that he had to burn all of the documentation of that aircraft in particular to prevent the construction secrets of this unknown and secret aircraft from being stolen by unknown, unnamed, and hostile parties. As the inventors tried to untangle that statement, Dr. Christmas then claimed to be the first person to fly an aircraft after the Wright brothers. The backers found this series of statements largely implausible, even from a man named Dr. Christmas. So a short while later, he reassured them with a second plane that was called the Redbird, which was, by all reports, an improbably near-exact copy of the AEA Red Wing. But it was named Redbird, and thus, in this early age of aviation, perhaps very different. And so I welcome you to the very strange place Dr. Christmas occupies in the golden era of aviation. Amusingly, we know all of these details of Dr. Christmas's life as it was the day after Christmas, 1910, on which the suit entitled Creed in Fulton versus the Christmas Airplane Company Incorporated et al. Was filed. Mr. Fulton, one of Dr. Christmas's investors from the previous year, was not just an aeronautical investor or an aircraft hobbyist. And strangely enough, he also had letters after his name. But he wasn't a medical doctor, because Mr. Fulton was in fact a lawyer, which means Dr. Christmas had, in legal terms, fucked up. And through this suit, we have a window into the early machinations of Dr. Christmas. As put before the Chicanery Court of Virginia, the suit suggested that Dr. Christmas was pretty much a crook who sold empty promises to unwise investors using a variety of aircraft-shaped, if not aircraft-themed props, and failing that, empty promises. And that much is verifiably true, as Dr. Christmas's presence at the Harvard-Boston Great Aero Meet in Massachusetts on August 19th of 1910 is well documented. That day, Dr. W.P. Christmas entered his, quote, Christmas biplane design, of which no documentation of it flying has ever been proven. Over the years, various partners allege Christmas would do precisely this, which is to tow his static display planes to air shows, and then never actually demonstrate or successfully sell a single one while simultaneously claiming to grossly surpass or greatly exceed the requirements of whatever trophy was on offer in any contest presented. And as such, Dr. Christmas's investors were not happy with planes that didn't fly, didn't sell, and never seemed to work. By 1912, without endeavoring to address its obvious shortcomings as a company, and with the threat of imminent legal issues, it was obvious that change would soon be necessary to save this bold if unproven startup. So Dr. Christmas then started the Durham Christmas Airplane Sales and Exhibition Company, which exhibited aircraft that nobody ever saw fly because they were towed to shows or existed in the mad imagination of Dr. Christmas. It was not uncommon on the East Coast of the United States in the early teens for Dr. Christmas to just show up at an air show, claiming he'd invented planes built around principles which no one but God and he understood. And it gets weirder still, because Dr. Christmas felt constrained and tragically underappreciated by all of these other small-thinking aircraft pretenders who built actual aircraft the general public recognized and actually celebrated. So naturally, as a bold pioneer and absolute genius in all matters aeronautical, he felt that he had to share his wisdom with a wider audience, which, amazingly, we have a sample of. Dr. Christmas wrote in the New York Times on 5th December 1915 that his warplanes would be the largest, heavier-than-air aircrafts ever built, powered by 1,600 horsepower motors, capable of carrying bombs and ammunition while having a 6-man crew. He described his planes as unstoppable and stated that the European allies had already ordered 11 of his superb, quote, battle cruisers, end quote. As you'd expect, no evidence of such planes as described by Dr. Christmas has ever been brought to light. However, this sort of bold, visionary stuff as promised in print had an actual effect. It attracted investors. More specifically, Dr. Christmas had attracted the attention and the direct financial support of Henry and Alfred McCory, who, as brothers, owned a New York brokerage firm. So amazingly, by 1918, Dr. Christmas started the Cantilever Aero Company and had relocated to New York. However, as we've discussed, by 1918, the world had changed. Dr. Christmas perhaps realized that the war was winding down, and he'd need to make something soon or risk making nothing at all, as designs had evolved rapidly and spectacularly so over the past 4 years. While no one had called him out for fanciful descriptions of planes that weren't real, no one was singing his praises either. And that, I feel, directly threatened his sense of greatness. People the world over knew of the SPAD 13, of the Sopwith Camel, of the Fokker D7 and DR-1. The Great War had planted the seed of daring aeronautics saving the world, of knights of the sky and dashing heroes fighting each other over Europe. The world was warming up to aviation. Soon enough, people were hungry for newer, better, faster planes. Even the mail would soon be carried through the air through regular service. It was a wild era, and planes grabbed the imagination like nothing else. It is on this stage that Dr. Christmas had decided to make his great play. as he felt the world was ready for his greatest work, his magnum opus. He would call it the Christmas Bullet. This is the part of the story where Dr. Christmas starts to truly earn the unfortunate title of con man, as instead of trying to impress his friends as most bullshitters dabbling in business do, he instead visited the Continental Aircraft Corporation of Long Island, New York, which was an actual aircraft company, and began to tell them a story. His pitch went like this. Dr. Christmas wasn't just designing a plane, he was designing the best plane in the world, or probably something very much like it. To sell this point, Dr. Christmas then claimed with multiple eyewitnesses that the aircraft he was designing would be the key element in a plot to kidnap Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who was, at that time, somewhat running parts of the German Empire. The parts at that point currently trying to shell Paris again at least. So, for the record, a crazy person born when the Civil War was winding down had stumbled into the offices of the Continental Aircraft Corporation, which was a real aircraft company manufacturing actual aircraft which flew more often than not, and had told them he was designing an emperor-snatching superplane to end the war and usher in a great new peace. Naturally, the management team and corporate directors at Continental Aircraft thought a moment, considered the outcomes, weighed their options, and then they agreed to help. Somehow, the mesmerizing charisma of Dr. Christmas had convinced the senior management of the Continental Aircraft Corporation to the point that they agreed to immediately devote significant resources to the project. And his mesmerizing Dr. Christmas effect doesn't stop there, for his good cheer and demeanor won him many friends from all walks of life. However, his favorite friends were mostly the wealthy and the powerful, and nearly exclusively those with assets or resources he could and would exhaustively use. Dr. Christmas approached New York Senator James Wolcott Wadsworth and in short time got him to back this war-ending and incredibly bold proposal. The senator agreed, probably because the plane would be built in New York. Also, crazy inventions were a dime a dozen in this time, so I somewhat understand him not paying the fullness of his attention on the matter. That and Dr. Christmas had an ability to dazzle people in ways we still have trouble understanding, as the radiating effects of Dr. Christmas are still being felt a century later, but we'll get to that. Dr. Christmas badly needed the senator's signature, as access to certain resources in wartime are strictly limited. However, at this juncture, we have to talk about the poor bastard who unfortunately had to watch all of this happen. The one sane voice we have in this chorus of madness. The one trustworthy one, at least. Enter Vincent Bernelli. Vincent Justice Bernelli was, at that time, the chief engineer at Continental. He would go on to have a long and storied career building and designing aircraft that worked pretty damn well. Personally, I feel he's one of the unsung heroes of early aviation, but the Christmas design as a collaboration between Continental Aircraft and the Good Doctor was his first true crisis in engineering, and I feel probably the real reason he tried so very hard for the rest of his life. So you're probably asking yourself, just what was Dr. Christmas's grand idea? This so-called plane of planes. Proposed as a scout, the first prototype of the Christmas Bullet broke most of the common rules of aviation as we understood them at the time. It was presented as a strutless aircraft, and Dr. Christmas boldly claimed that the Bullet would effortlessly make 175 miles an hour with a proposed range of 550 miles and a service ceiling in excess of 14,000 feet. If any of those promises were realized, the Bullet would have been truly remarkable. If all of those, it would have been revolutionary. However, then you look at what shape and form those promises take, and yeah, you naturally begin to have doubts. On paper, it looked bad, real bad. So the chief at Continental Aircraft started to raise concerns, because he knew better. He also knew math, fairly handy that Bernelli patiently documented many of the fairly serious issues with the aircraft as proposed, and repeatedly raised issue to Continental management. He was then overruled by Continental management. Bernelli was deeply concerned, and rightfully so, with the design theories Dr. Christmas had been suggesting around the offices at Continental, so he began to keep a diary. For example, Dr. Christmas had suggested that all-wood construction with veneer cladding would reduce aerodynamic drag to unrealistic extents, and that was the least concerning problem, for Dr. Christmas simultaneously claimed to be the inventor and originator of such a construction system, which he then also claimed to have patents on. This was again a continual Dr. Christmas trend. Bernelli knew full well that none of this was true, but offered to help all the same, though I presume he must have been screaming inside. After all, Dr. Christmas had just casually claimed to invent methods of aircraft construction already fully in use by the powers of Europe, then currently at war, which suggested either Dr. Christmas was very unaware of how airplanes were actually made, or that he was, at the dawn of the 20th century, the first living embodiment of fake-it-till-you-make-it philosophy applied to ruinous scale. Why Bernelli initially went along with this, I feel, is perhaps a result of realizing that aviation was frequently a grim business for those who said impossible too early, even if the impossible was, in fact, impossible. As such, Bernelli would insist, and the historical record supports, that his input upon the Christmas bullet was limited to the design of the veneer cladding on the fuselage, and that all of his serious, repeatedly expressed concerns over the rest of the aircraft from theory to construction were overridden by Dr. Christmas telling another folksy story or anecdote to describe how the plane would certainly work. In short, Dr. Christmas would continue to get his way by mesmerizing the room until they all agreed with him. Even in a room full of aviation experts, even while knowing nothing of practical aviation, even while saying things that were, even then, commonly understood to be untrue, he got his way. And thus, I refer again to what I call the Dr. Christmas effect. For instance, when asked on why his planes lacked wing supports or spars and thus actual structural rigidity in flight, Dr. Christmas insisted that the wings be flexible and flap, like a bird does, of course. And nobody stopped him. They all nodded, save Bernelli, who determined to try to stop it. But before Dr. Christmas's bold ideas could actually be tested, there was the engine problem, as in the bullet didn't have one yet. Wartime production had strictly reduced the availability of war material like high-output engines. The engine needed for the Christmas bullet was a Liberty 6, which looked like this. For early pursuit aircraft, Liberty 6 was damn near ideal. They were so ideal that their availability was practically impossible, as they were a controlled war material item slated for use in actual aircraft fighting an actual war. But Dr. Christmas had friends in high places, so the Army was forced to give Dr. Christmas and CAC one Liberty 6 power plant for ground tests only. A ground test means that the plane should not leave the ground, and that the engine should not leave the ground, or be used in a plane that does at any point. These were the conditions of the engine being loaned to CAC for the application in the Christmas bullet, as the government was a fair bit skeptical of the flappy airplane and its unproven and eccentric designer. It was at this point a test flight was scheduled in complete violation of that limited use requirement, because Dr. Christmas said so. Vincent Justice Bernelli was at the end of his rope, as he knew the Christmas bullet was a death trap. He knew Dr. Christmas was full of shit, and he knew that if he continued, somebody was going to die. Overridden by Dr. Christmas and consolidated management at every turn, Bernelli did the honorable thing. He resigned from Continental Aircraft in protest and walked away. He refused to sign off on a joke or be associated professionally with a madman, regardless of the promised fame or wealth. And with Bernelli now gone, it was all on Christmas for a miracle. I must say that finding a willing person to get into an untested, unproven design, let alone an obvious death trap of an aircraft, was a lot easier back in the teens. Life expectancy was far lower for a variety of reasons. Cigarettes were unfiltered and considered healthy to an extent. The First World War burned Europe to ash, and barnstorming would soon be a sport. Needless to say, it was an adventurous time for those who learned to turn off the fear. So when Cuthbert Mills, former Army aviator turned pilot for the U.S. Mail Service, was selected to fly the Bullet, he was actually proud. He still wanted to fly the world-changing aircraft even after seeing it in person. So I am going to say that Cuthbert Mills was a very brave man. He was so proud of his selection as test pilot that he invited his mother to watch him take the Bullet on its first test flight. And she did, because she was proud of her boy. As records indicate, the Christmas Bullet's maiden flight was January 1919, and a few hundred feet into the air, the wings peeled right off the aircraft. As such, test pilot Cuthbert Mills bought the farm that day. And to Dr. Christmas's credit, he would indeed be famous, but not for anything he actually did. To celebrate this obviously massive success, Dr. Christmas placed an ad in Flying Magazine claiming that the Christmas Bullet had achieved 197-mile-an-hour top speed demonstrated at Central Park in Long Island, which I suppose it technically achieved, but only briefly, and in the direction of down. The destruction of the Army engine was never revealed to the government, and its loss was never investigated. Mills' death was suppressed through the efforts of Dr. Christmas. Even though this happened in New York, which was a densely populated part of the world even back then, the death of Cuthbert Mills became a non-event. And friends, I'll say this, it gets stranger still. Aviation journalist J.D. Van Ville claimed that the aircraft had successfully completed 5 test flights and that the pilot Mills had landed safely and praised the Bullet's handling and capabilities. Mills was now famous in print as a test pilot, according to an aviation journalist. The very same journalist would praise the Bullet well until the 1930s, claiming later in Popular Aviation that the Christmas Bullet as flown in 1919 was the world's first cantilever monoplane, which, considering that the Junkers J-1, the actual first cantilever monoplane, flew quite well 3 years before the Bullet bitted, is a bit strange as a statement to be made by an aviation journalist in print, which suggests that the journalist was either completely bullshitting the industry for unknown reasons, or that Dr. Christmas's effect again demonstrates the improbable capability of mesmerizing aviation experts and industry leaders, regardless of distance or time. Dr. Christmas, though, had in fact kept Mills' death fairly quiet, regardless of his famous appearance in journals post-mortem. It is unfortunate to note that aviation incidents were a fair bit more common back in 1919. However, media and advertising had been organized to paint over the loss of a pilot while praising the design. The truth of Mills' death and the details of many further events surrounding this cursed company survive only thanks to Vincent Bernelli, who had documented everything during design and had then stayed in touch afterward with friends at CAC, deeply worried about the people now trapped in Dr. Christmas's flying circus. Bernelli's account asserts that many pilots were approached to fly the Bullet, who then refused to fly the plane once they saw it up close, and that Mills was merely the first to say yes. Bernelli had thought at the time that this death and destruction would be the end of the Christmas Bullet as a project, and likely Dr. Christmas's aviation ambitions as a concept. Bernelli perhaps hoped that Dr. Christmas would crash and burn, leaving the world a safer place. However, Bernelli's account foreshadows what follows with, "But I underestimated the doc." The loss of the first Bullet, and catastrophically, its engine was threatening the aviation greatness of Dr. Christmas. Regardless of what was printed for the public, the backers and people at Continental Aircraft knew that the first bullet was very suddenly gone, as was its test pilot. Dr. Christmas needed a miracle to stay in business, so through his connections, he convinced the Army to loan him a propeller for a second bullet, without ever bothering to tell them that the first had exploded. And then, with a privately acquired Hull-Scott L6 engine, Continental Aircraft completed the second airframe. Not content to give us a single bullet, Dr. Christmas doubled down, and at other people's expense and influence, he produced another in the near same fashion, which was then paraded, but not flown, for public spectacle. When a contemporary technical description with photographs and drawings appeared in Flight Magazine's 13th February 1919 edition, the question of aircraft safety was raised by the periodical's aviation experts. So Dr. Christmas claimed a safety factor of 7 throughout. Perhaps you did not hear what I said, but this is the part where I let you feel the full power of the Dr. Christmas effect. So I repeat. When asked about the obvious safety problems with his design, Dr. Christmas responded that his design had a safety factor of 7. I need you to hear what I'm saying, so I'll say it once more. When asked why his plane looked like an unmade bed about to fall apart, Dr. Christmas told them it contained 7 safety. 7 safety, for those of you who don't know, is a number right about here on the scale of imaginary and whimsical bullshit. And yet, the aviation world glossed over and accepted it. The second bullet was also taken to, but not flown or demonstrated at the New York Air Show that year as a static display, where again Dr. Christmas claimed it to be the easiest, safest plane to fly in the whole wide world. Which, for a plane that had killed 1 out of 1 of its pilots and 1 out of 1 of its flights, seems a bit disingenuous. However, even in this wild era, there is a limit to the amount of madness you can tolerate, which Dr. Christmas frequently pushed. He began to claim that Britain and France, on his word alone with no proof whatsoever, had expressed interest in sizable purchases of his aircraft due to the Christmas bullets' demonstrated benefits. What demonstrated benefits and versus what aircraft, I cannot say. But Dr. Christmas certainly knew and sold his ideas all the same, without any proof. But these are not even the boldest claims of this era of Dr. Christmas's life. For instance, immediately after the Great War, Dr. Christmas claimed Germany had offered him $1 million in gold to rebuild the entire aviation industry, regardless of the international restrictions placed on post-war Germany in aircraft production. He also claimed at multiple points thereafter to have invented the aileron. But regardless of what he'd said or was printed, the facts remained. One plane had crashed, and the other was a prop living on borrowed time. Any sane man in this situation would have stopped there, enfolded perhaps, just like the wings of the Christmas bullet. But Dr. Christmas was not one to back down from destiny, even if that destiny was entirely self-appointed. And so, in defiance of good reason, on 27th April 1919, in Nassau County, New York, the second bullet took to the air. At the controls was decorated World War I pilot, an American volunteer, Ellington Joyce Jolly, who'd flown for the French prior to America's entry into the war. He'd been decorated by the French government and earned the rank of captain in the French Air Force during the conflict. He was a capable aviator, currently serving as a lieutenant in the post-war United States Army Air Service with serious flight time spent in difficult circumstances. And 4 months after the first bullet crashed, the second similarly shed its wings and went into a barn at speed, killing the pilot on impact. With the headline "Christmas Killing Jolly" being fairly negative even back then, the good Dr. Christmas decided to get ahead of any naysayers by printing his own take on events, which are truly very interesting. A May 1919 issue of Vanity Fair has Dr. Christmas touting the bullet's flawless safety record. No mention of either test pilot dying appears, just the plane, and of course, its repeated claims to exceptional performance. Nobody really bothered to dig too terribly deep, as Continental Aircraft was a small company, and thus a non-competitor to anyone who'd want to expose their gross incompetence and shameful negligence in allowing someone like Dr. Christmas anywhere near aircraft design. In a sane world, Dr. Christmas would have had his day in court over something like this. He'd concealed the destruction of government property, destroyed government property, killed 2 pilots, and exercised numerous counts of fraud and reckless negligence, depending on the prosecutorial point of view. However, the end of 1918 and the first few months of 1919 brought change. Coincidentally, around the same time, the government largely stopped caring about their missing property, as it now had new problems, like how to get everyone home as safely and cheaply as possible as the war had ended. The peace conference would continue what the war began, and as such, everything no longer required for a peacetime army was, well, deemed to be surplus. As the issuing of the Liberty 6 engine came so close to the end of the conflict, its uninvestigated disappearance is likely a result of being lost in the chaos of Allied forces now rotating home, if not the rapid stand-down of government procurement services post-war. I will say at this juncture, any sane man would have kept quiet about this sort of thing. But this was Dr. William Whitney Christmas, and so the good doctor went to the House Select Committee on Expenditures of the War Department. But why tell you about it when I can show you? Because, thankfully, we have the entire transcript. Please enjoy the following selection as a recreation by the Black Pants Legion.
All rise. Please be seated. This is a House Subcommittee number 1 on Aviation for Select Committee on Expenditures in the War Department, August 5th in the year of our Lord, 1919. Honorable Walter W. McGee presiding, New York, 35th District. First testimony is William Whiting, Christmas.
Note, the government transcript gives his name as Dr. William Whiting Christmas, not Whitney, as other records match. Given his activities up to this point, I understand if his middle name is inaccurate or a fabrication. He is sworn in by Congressman McGee, and then the show begins.
So, Dr. Christmas, where do you reside?
I am residing at the present time in New York City.
And how long have you resided there?
Well, about 3 years.
May I ask your present age?
52.
Where did you reside prior to that time?
In Washington City.
How long did you reside there?
About 30 years.
And where prior to that?
In North Carolina.
Right, and is that your native state?
Yes, sir.
Alright, so where were you educated?
I was educated at the public schools of Washington and at the University of Virginia and George Washington University.
You graduated from the University of Virginia?
Yes.
Alright, excellent. In what class?
In the class of 1885, I think.
So what is your present occupation in the city of New York?
I am the president of the Cantilever Aero Company.
And is that a corporation?
Yes, sir, that is a corporation.
When was it created?
When?
Yes, when was it organized?
About a year ago. My profession is that of a scientist, pure and simple.
Yes, he is something of a scientist. Yes, he says that to the committee. Yes, it's on the record. And painfully, it's the last semi-accurate thing he says in this entire testimony.
Oh, yes, sir.
Now, there have been a great many instances of accidents, especially training accidents to our boys in learning to fly, as well as in flying. What do you attribute these accidents to?
Well, that is a very important question, and it involves quite a considerable explanation. If I had a blackboard, I could make yourself and the committee thoroughly appreciate these explanations. In the first place, we know that the design itself is so faulty that the machine, in sustaining itself in the air, is poised on a point, which is called the center
Now, are
of
you
effort.
describing any particular machine?
I am describing the machine which the government has had in universal use, and it is only of
How
one type.
do you designate that machine?
That is what is called a parallel truss machine, whether it is the de Havilland 4, the de Havilland 9, the Curtis JN4, the Oriole, or the Bluebird. Every one is precisely alike, except that it is painted differently. The principle is precisely the same, and the photographs would clearly show that.
When asked about his own capabilities, Dr. Christmas truly shines.
The nature has had a very great advance start of us in the development of flying apparatus, and we can attribute it to nothing but ignorance if man attempts to go aside from bird flight in airplane designing. Because, gentlemen of the committee, it simply cannot be done. I have been through it, and it has caused me to spend a great deal of time, and has cost me a great deal of money, and I think I understand the situation.
Does your company produce a bombing plane?
We are the only company in the world that can produce any kind of plane, whether it is strutless plane, or flexible wing plane, or any type of plane whatsoever. Other companies must confine themselves on account of patents, which I hold, to this parallel truss type of machine.
And does your company produce a pursuit plane?
We have produced a plane which is easily 60 miles an hour faster than any other machine in the world, but owing to the prejudice...
You have produced such a plane?
Yes, sir.
A pursuit plane?
Yes, sir. That is what is called a pursuit, or fighting, or scout plane.
Now, the testimony here shows that there was not a pursuit plane or a fighting plane produced in this country and sent overseas during the World War. How long would it take your company to produce a pursuit plane suitable for service at the front?
We could do it in 6 weeks with the force that we have, and that force has been diminished, I might say. Now, while this machine was operating with 3 or 4 machines, the others came down as this storm began to develop in intensity, and this machine, the Christmas Bullet, was the last machine which was doing any exhibition flying. At the time that this machine was in flight, and just before it came to the ground, and a few minutes before it came to the ground, the storm had pretty well developed into a very heavy gale. And, Colonel Harpin and the other officers, in looking at the plane, remarked at its extraordinary steadiness, while these other machines were being roughly handled by the wind. This is known as the Christmas Bullet.
Is that what the flying machine that you produced is called? Or is that only one type of the machine?
That is the only type that we have got.
What other types of flying machine does your company produce?
Of course, these machines are named by their makers' different names, but the principle involved in all my machines is precisely the same. That is to say, as close a mechanical simulation of true bird flight as it is possible to give it.
And you call this the Christmas Bullet?
Yes, sir.
Have you any other designated names of machine produced at your plant?
Yes, sir. We have machines called the Streak, and the Hawk, and the Eagle. We have these under design and in production.
Have you the negatives of these pictures of machines taken in the air?
These negatives were taken by the government, and when we asked for copies of these photographs, we were refused permission to get them.
By the government?
Dr. Christmas produced before the committee patriotic letters of intent he blindly sent to the Secretary of War, which we have.
Honorable Newton D. Baker, Secretary of War, Washington, D.C. My dear Secretary, it is safe to say in all your life's history, you have never received a more serious, sincere, and momentous communication than this. Just at this time, the President and yourself want strong and virile friends who will, by their devotion, protect instead of obstruct. I do not believe any man can sympathize with you more than myself, because if there is in this country a man of whom more lies of unlimited number have been spread broadcast about him than myself, I would like to know that man. They would not do anything, The only thing in the world they wanted to do with our apparatus was to have us bring it to Dayton, Ohio, and let them break it up.
And what do you mean by, and break it up?
I mean precisely what I say. They were going to pile in weight and sand until the whole structure gave away, and then tell us the machine wouldn't do, like they had done others.
They had considerable trouble at the Dayton Experimental Laboratories.
Oh, they have had nothing but trouble all the time. The condition there is absolutely chaotic.
And who was responsible for the conditions up there?
Of course, I lay the responsibility on the last man, the man who was last higher up. I think the responsibility should be laid upon Secretary Baker's shoulders entirely because...
What was the trouble at Dayton? Do you know?
The trouble at Dayton, as we found it, was this. There was a certain type of machine that they were going to use regardless of the blood they spilled in France or in this country. And they intended to use it regardless of any kind of advancement anywhere else, whether mechanical or physical.
And what kind of machine was it?
The Parallel Truss Machine, which was exhibited by Thomas Moores, Dayton Wright, and the Curtis Company.
How many different types of machines have you actually made?
Well, there are only two types that you can make, the pusher and the tractor type. You either have got to put the screw in the front or behind. As regards to the monoplane or biplane, there are only two types that can be made, monoplane or a biplane. I have made both of those kinds.
I had reference to difference in size as well as in design. I think they wanted to know to what stage you had progressed.
I made machines all the way from 86 feet across the wings down to 24 feet.
And how many machines have you completed, including the machine ready for operation?
Since we have been manufacturing, you mean?
Yes.
On Long Island?
I mean your total finished product.
We have only built, with the capital we had, 2 machines. We have in course of construction just now 6 more.
There was no time prior to the conclusion of the war that you had a finished machine to test with and demonstrate in actual flying, was there?
No.
When you went to the War Department with the bombing machine that you referred to, that was purely a design?
Yes.
It was not any machine that you could demonstrate with?
No.
Is it not your idea that perhaps it was more difficult for you to get a hearing from the fact that so many designers and inventors were pressing their claims upon the department?
The productive capacity of my factory is not at the present time very great, but we shall, in the near future, about the 1st of September, build a very large plant and have a very large production.
I understand during the war you could have gotten plenty of financial backing.
Oh, yes.
You have flown in your own machines, have you?
Yes, sir, I have flown in my machine. The last machine, which we have under specific discussion, the last development, I have not, sir.
Which ones did you fly?
The ones I developed several years ago. I gave up flying several years ago.
You have never flown in the types you have described here today?
No, sir.
What was the offer made by Germany for your services?
Germany offered me $1,000 a day in all expenses and 3 years' salary in advance, in gold, in any bank in New York City, or anywhere in this country, and before I left this country.
I did not understand the latter part of your answer.
3 years' salary in advance, in gold, in any bank, before I left the shores of this country.
$1,000 a day?
Yes, sir.
That would be over $1 million?
Yes, sir. Considerably over that. I would not have ever seen this country again, I can tell you that. I never had the pleasure of collecting that, or of doing anything with that $1 million. Yes, sir, I submitted plans to Colonel Mitchell, I think he was. I know General Squire very well. I went to see General Johnson.
Dr. Christmas is on the record suggesting that the photographs of the bullet flying as perfectly as had been claimed had then been destroyed somehow by the government, who was actively working in collusion with other unnamed industrial powers, also working to destroy Dr. Christmas. He then asserted on the record that the government testing facility for government-approved aircraft was out to get him, and that their tests were designed to destroy perfectly good airframes for no reason other than to prevent them from being approved. Dr. Christmas is actually on the record getting furious at Dayton Experimental Labs for insisting on structurally testing aircraft to destruction before they get into the sky. He saw this as unnecessary safety testing, as a concept that is. Dr. Christmas then expends enormous energy lambasting the committee, the government, and other aviation pioneers, all for not heeding his wisdom or seeing the benefits of his magnificent, boundless genius. Through his committee questioning, Dr. Christmas painted himself as a man constrained by excessive systemic failures which had stalled actual meaningful progress by pioneers such as himself. If they fit under the tires, Christmas threw them under the bus and dropped names at every opportunity, from a young Billy Mitchell to the fucking secretary of the War Department. His ability to change subjects is, as well, a master course in obfuscation. In that strange time and odd place, it actually worked. By 1923, Dr. Christmas decided he'd had enough fun and folded his serious aircraft concerns after one last act, which was to build the United States Army for $100,000 for the use of his patented wing design. Dr. William Whitney Christmas never stopped getting away with it. When his companies failed to deliver any promised product, technology, or measurable engineering achievement, Dr. Christmas would cross state lines, start fresh companies with new backers, and once again flush with cash, he would continue his charade despite never once meaningfully contributing toward the industry he claimed so ardently to serve. Dr. Christmas was a complex man, to be certain, and this analysis is by no means exhaustive, but I feel strongly that above all other things, he believed so much in his own destiny, his own masquerade of greatness, that lowly concepts such as basic morality were inconsequential to his journey. Anything that furthered his goals to include killing human beings was acceptable grist for his mill to grind, even if the product in the end was in no way useful or even capable of fulfilling basic requirements. Dr. Christmas would risk human life just for the chance at greatness, or just to keep the dream alive until new investors materialized. All of his madness may have been forgiven had he made a significant achievement, or any achievement at all. That, however, would have required actual talent, and Dr. Christmas's best talents were in talking, not doing, and thus Dr. William Whitney Christmas serves as a lasting warning to the rest of us. To understand the scope of Dr. Christmas's effect on his perception throughout history, even this long after his measurable relevance has passed, please consider that no one save Bernelli really challenged the man about anything. It is because of Bernelli we know much of this story, as he kept detailed notes and talked with everyone caught up in this mad affair. Bernelli's admission of understanding Dr. Christmas proved prophetic, as Dr. Christmas would never stop spinning stories of his remarkable genius, regardless of any inconvenient truths. But at no point did Dr. Christmas ever lose major credibility in the public eye, aviation press, or the esteem of his peers while he was alive, regardless of what he said or did. The following highlights of his post-bullet career, I feel adequately proves that Dr. Christmas never stopped being, well, Dr. William Whitney Christmas. For instance, years later, he attempted to resell what he could mostly remember of Bernelli's own wing designs, though terribly copied and poorly understood in principle, through attempted patent abuse. Yes, he made models. No, they did not fly. Oh, and friends, let me tell you, his genius is not constrained to aircraft, as he considered himself truly a boundless visionary and at one point, fit to inform policymaking. He stated for the record to Congress that there should be a number of immediate changes to the aviation industry to include a stipend for intrepid investors who made titanic contributions to the world of aviation, such as himself. He was very much like that. In 1935, he would offer his suggestions to the airport of tomorrow, which we have a model of here. It was an underground airport design featuring a central spiral. Yes, he thought the airport of the future should have planes all flying toward the center of a giant hubcap and then landing at any angle they wanted, then taxi underground, where planes are naturally happiest. Yes, it is in fact an underground airport in the worst possible shape, encouraging frequent head-on air traffic as a standard model of efficient operation. He promised this very concept of airport to arrive in the not-too-distant future. They printed this, and nobody said anything. He was, of course, a pioneer and allowed to do these things. After dabbling with airport renaissance, he became employed with the General Development Corporation, a Miami real estate company, which he later became the vice president of. As late as his 85th birthday, stories manifest in publication of Dr. Christmas suggesting his being in talks with government leaders over the design and construction of enormous aerial battleships. Because, I suppose, at that point, why not? He'd faked it so hard, he'd made it. In the end, Dr. Christmas lived a long and prosperous life, dying at the age of 94 in the spring of 1960. But I feel Dr. Christmas is contrasted best by the man who kept the receipts from working with him. The unsilent witness was largely the only reason we know anything about the true scope and scale of this catastrophe. Engineer Vincent Justice Bernelli, grounded in actual reality and possessing actual demonstrated talent, Bernelli spent the rest of his life trying to forget the bullet, Dr. Christmas, and the once promising job at Consolidated Aircraft. He left CAC for a job in Wisconsin, where he built the world's very first airliner, the Lawson L-4. As a successful pioneer of lifting bodies and flying wings as early as the 1920s, Bernelli was an actual innovator who patiently applied his craft, content to always find room to improve upon the skills he had developed. By the end of his life, he was theorizing space planes. Yes, Bernelli basically invented Aerodyne dropships in the 1960s. Yeah, he was that good. And I feel his career is a result of feeling compelled to never again let the adventures of a moron threaten to destroy what could be a prosperous and promising benefit for all mankind. So in the end, do remember, the cost of a happy Christmas is perhaps not all it's cracked up to be. The following artists have made this lesson possible, and I want to allow them to showcase their own work because you should probably hire them. They're good people and definitely worth your support. As far as me, I try not to shill, but my people do have to eat actual food, so slap that Patreon up there if you please. If you didn't know, I occasionally talk Battletech as an in-universe character through a format that's probably far too long and diatribe heavy to be actually healthy. Occasionally, I also shitpost, and throughout my team has been more dedicated to charity than any other financial cause, even our survival. Over on the right, you'll see a donation link, which even if you don't feel this film is exactly your cup of tea, I would appreciate your participation in the good cause if possible. Next time around, we have to talk about chemical warfare, homemade anti-personnel mines, and the absolute joys of owning an alligator. At any rate, I'll close the chapter on this history. Class dismissed. Cessna guy coming by around. This Cessna guy flies in orbit up and down the river every day because he wants people to know that he has spent $400,000 to drive the equivalent of a checker marathon in a figure eight. He wants people to know that he is above us, and he has paid for this privilege to fly a shoddy aircraft in a figure eight. Here's the plane guy again. I have a Cessna. I fly it in circles. Please consider me a pilot. I will bring it up at the TGI Fridays I go to every day, where I carry my pilot's thing so people know I'm a pilot. I have a Cessna. It's slower than driving in some cases. I pay for this privilege. I have a Cessna. Maybe Consolidated Aircraft just believed in the magic of Christmas. Okay, that's bad.
This just in, Christmas kills Jolly, a real zinger of a headline, a real hootenanny of hot topics. Well, I bet that man's just butting his buttons to get a hold of this malarkey.
Yeah, just as I fucking start, my nemesis, Mr. Train, shows up. I just want everyone to know, for every hour you hear of recording, there's probably 4 of me wrestling with trains and Cessnas, and that same guy flying figure eights over my house to show that he has a Cessna, which is ironic considering what we're doing a recording on. But I guess this is a very ironic era, huh? So Hunt's found this guy that made a video of him flying a model of the Christmas Bullet, which we put in this video. The guy gave his permission, really cool guy, named Julio Fairley. And the video is called Christmas Bullet from 1919. Thank you, Mr. Train. Thank you. Thank you for interrupting that. Thank you. I might as well just put a cast and crew in the video, starring Mr. Train, starring Diesel Locomotive, the bane of my existence. Schedules? What's that? Nah, we don't need no fucking schedules. We'll just come through any which time we want. Oh, what's that? How many times do we honk when a train passes? Well, it's like a bad DM, my friends. It's like a D100. Every D100 minutes, D20 trains will pass, and these D20 trains will honk D100 times. We have one guy who comes by at like 6 in the morning, who is like a DJ on that train horn. Like he's sitting there doing Daft Punk up there, and is just like beep, 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 beep. I'm like, son of a bitch. I hate the train. Mr. Train, boo. I'm not, God, it is so annoying. Alright, so, next up, we have, well, most people watch this for Battletech, and so I guess we can tell people that next time on Tech Talks Anything will actually be Battletech, because little did you know we're capable of making 2 movies at the same time. We didn't know either, so we were doing that. The Hunchback is like more than half done, so ha! I think I'm proving that it's entirely possible to make multiple feature-length films a year if you really try. It really makes you wonder where Hollywood uses all that fucking budget, right? I mean, to quote Canon Films, if you gave me $100 million, I'd make 100 million movies. The shitposts have only begun. What do you guys think we could make a Night Fight City movie for real?
Yes, sir, I submitted plans to Colonel Mitchell, I think he was. I know General Squire very well, and I went to see General Johnson, and General Homer Simpson, General Flambadoo. EOA. Okay, I don't know. I immediately ran out of names.